You think you know Sadako because you've seen her crawl out of a television screen. Hair dripping wet, face hidden under strands of black, and that unforgettable posture of a human body moving in ways it should never move. But if that's all you know, then you only know the meme version of her. The Halloween costume version. The pop culture cutout that Hollywood sold back to the world. The truth is that the girl in the well didn't just appear out of nowhere like a cursed chain letter. She was built from centuries of Japanese folklore. Layers of theater art and collective nightmares stacked on top of one another like VHS tapes crammed into a dusty shelf. And that's the part most people miss. If you've only watched the 2002 American remake, you probably think Sadako is called Samara. You probably think her curse started in some creepy barn in Washington state. And you probably think the scariest thing about her is that she doesn't moisturize. But none of that gets at why she exists in the first place. In fact, the real question isn't how a girl can crawl through a TV. It's why her image has stayed alive for over 30 years and why she feels instantly familiar even to people who have never watched a single frame of The Ring. The answer is that Sadako is more than a ghost in a scary movie. She's the modern face of something Japan has been telling stories about for over 1,000 years. The vengeful dead women who refuse to lie quietly in their graves. The spirits called yurei, and more specifically, the onryo. Spirits who come back, not for comfort, not for closure, but for revenge. These were the characters painted on Edo-era scrolls, the ones actors put on stage in kabuki theaters, their long hair falling loose, their white burial kimonos dragging behind them, their eyes dark with rage. If you look closely, Sadako isn't new. She's just the VHS upgrade of one of the oldest monsters in Japanese storytelling. But let's rewind for a second. The image of Sadako crawling out the television is so iconic that people forget what it actually means. That scene is not just jump scare choreography. It's the perfect metaphor for folklore leaking out into modern life. She's not supposed to stay inside her story. She's supposed to crawl out and find you wherever you live, on whatever screen you use. And whether that screen is a TV in 1998, a VHS tape in 2002, or a YouTube video you're watching right now, the effect is the same. She's viral. In the most literal, cursed way possible. So today, we're going to ask the big questions. Who really is Sadako? Where does she come from? And why has she managed to haunt audiences across decades and continents? Is she just a scary girl in a well? Or is she something much bigger? Something older? Something tied to the way entire cultures process fear and trauma? As it turns out, the curse of Sadako isn't just 7 days long. It's been centuries in the making. And if you really want to understand why she crawled into your living room, you have to look back much further than a VHS tape. If you really want to understand Sadako, you can't just start with the 90s novel or the movie where she crawls through a TV. You have to start with the ghosts that were already haunting Japan for more than 1,000 years before Koji Suzuki ever typed a word. In Japan, the dead don't always stay put. They can come back as yurei, a word that literally means faint spirit or dim soul. Yurei are not like the cartoon ghosts of the West, floating around with sheets on their heads or rattling chains for comic relief. They are solemn, tragic, terrifying, and above all, they are unfinished. They come back to the living because something went wrong in death. And within this larger category of yurei, there is a specific, deeply feared type, the onryo. These are the spirits of people, most often women, who died with feelings of betrayal, rage, or injustice burning so hot that their souls could not rest. Onryo are not gentle whispers in the night. They are not benevolent guardians who linger to comfort the living. They are fueled by vengeance. Their purpose is to make sure that the living pay for what was done to them, even if it takes generations. To see where this idea comes from, we have to look back as far as the Heian era, between the 8th and 12th centuries. This was a time when courtly aristocrats wrote diaries and poetry filled with supernatural encounters. Some of the earliest ghost stories from this period describe women who died in despair, often because of unfaithful lovers, and who returned to wreak havoc. The court culture of the Heian elite was obsessed with emotions that were too intense to be controlled. Jealousy, sorrow, longing, these were seen as forces that could linger beyond death. The stories told of women transformed into fiery spirits or grotesque apparitions when they had been wronged, as if human rage itself could melt into something immortal. As centuries passed, these ghostly figures moved from literature into the visual arts and theatre. In the Edo period, roughly the 17th to 19th centuries, Japanese artists began painting ghost scrolls known as kaiden-e. These scrolls depicted yurei with the features that are now instantly recognizable: long black hair falling loose around the face, white burial kimono, the same robes used in funerary rituals, arms limp at the sides, with wrists dangling at impossible angles. These images were powerful because they crystallized fear into a visual template. Once you'd seen one, you could recognize it forever. At the same time, theater traditions like no and kabuki brought these spirits to life on stage. In no plays, performers used minimal gestures and haunting masks to evoke the presence of spirits, often women betrayed by love who returned with burning resentment. Kabuki, with its more elaborate costumes and dramatic flourishes, made the onryo into true icons of horror. Actors would wear long black wigs, let their hair fall loose across their faces, and shuffle forward in white robes under dim light. Imagine sitting in an Edo-era theater, the air thick with smoke from oil lamps, and watching a pale woman's figure glide onto stage, her voice trembling with anger from beyond the grave. The audience didn't need subtitles to understand. This was the embodiment of fury that cannot die. And the themes were always the same. A woman betrayed by a man she loved, a servant treated unjustly by her master, someone whose death was cruel, premature, or unfair. In a world where women had few avenues for justice, the supernatural became the place where they found their power. Onryo were not just scary stories, they were symbols of what happens when cruelty goes unpunished. One of the most famous examples is Okiku, the servant girl from the tale of Bancho Sarayashiki. Okiku worked for a wealthy samurai who tried to seduce her. When she rejected him, he tricked her by hiding one of the 10 valuable plates she was tasked with guarding. Accusing her of negligence, he condemned her to death. She was beaten and thrown into a well. Afterward, her ghost began to haunt the household. Each night, she would crawl out of the well and count the plates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2. And then a piercing scream when she reached 10 and realized one was missing. The story was so popular that it spread across kabuki plays, no adaptations, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, and oral storytelling. Okiku became the blueprint, the betrayed woman, murdered unjustly, returning from a well to terrify the living. Now, pause for a moment and connect that image to Sadako, a young woman, murdered unjustly, her body dumped in a well, her hair falling over her face. A curse that emerges night after night, unstoppable. It's not coincidence. Sadako is Okiku's descendant. She's the digital age reincarnation of that same archetype. The onryo never went away. They just found new media to crawl through. And the DNA of these spirits is everywhere in Japanese culture. Think about why the hair is always long and loose. In life, women were expected to bind their hair neatly. In death, the hair comes undone, symbolizing loss of order and loss of control. Think about the white robes. Those are not Halloween costumes. They are actual garments used for corpses, marking the spirit as belonging to the dead. Even the limp wrists have meaning. In art, the arms of yurei are depicted as powerless, dangling, a sign of how they were robbed of agency in life. But when the spirit moves, those same powerless arms become weapons. Sadako's creators didn't invent her out of thin air. They borrowed from centuries of imagery and gave it a modern frame. Instead of counting plates, she shows you a videotape. Instead of crawling out of a wooden well into a samurai's house, she crawls through the television into yours. The shape of the story is old. The technology is new. That's why it works so well. It also explains why Sadako's rage feels so believable. She's not just some random monster. She is rooted in a tradition that says rage itself can survive death. That when someone suffers injustice without closure, the wound festers and spreads. For Okiku, it was an unfaithful master. For Sadako, it was a life of mistreatment, secrecy, and violence. In both cases, the rage didn't die. It infected the living. When Japanese audiences first saw Sadako in the 90s, they weren't just watching a ghost story. They were watching a remix of images and ideas they had known for centuries. They recognized the loose hair, the burial robes, the well. They knew that an onryo had come back, and that once she had, nothing would stop her. And when Western audiences encountered Sadako's American cousin Samara in the early 2000s, they didn't need the cultural background to be terrified. The archetype worked across borders. Because injustice, rage, and fear of the dead are universal. This is what makes Sadako different from so many other horror villains. She's not just the product of one writer's imagination. She is the heir to a whole tradition of ghostly vengeance that had been simmering in Japan for centuries. When you see her crawl out of the TV, you're not just watching a spooky scene. You're witnessing the latest performance in a theater that began long before cinema existed. The Heian poets would have recognized her. The Edo audiences at kabuki theaters would have screamed in fear and delight. And we, sitting in our modern living rooms, recognize her too, even if we don't realize we're seeing 1,000 years of storytelling condensed into one dripping, furious girl in white. Sadako is not new. She is the digital echo of Okiku, of every betrayed woman whose story ended too soon, of every ghost painted with long hair and dark eyes on scrolls centuries ago. The folklore of yurei, the wrath of the onryo, all of it bleeds through her. That is why she still terrifies us. Not because of one cursed VHS, but because she carries the weight of an entire tradition of ghosts who refuse to stay buried. Sadako may feel like she has existed forever, but the first time she appeared by name was in a book. In 1991, Japanese novelist Koji Suzuki published Ring, the novel that would become the foundation for one of the most famous horror franchises in the world. At first glance, it was a simple story of a cursed videotape that dooms anyone who watches it. But at the center of that curse is Sadako Yamamura, and her backstory in the novel is far stranger, more tragic, and more complicated than most moviegoers ever realize. Suzuki did not just borrow the shape of the onryo from older folklore, he rewired it. In the book, Sadako isn't simply a wronged woman returning from death to punish those who hurt her. She is born different from the very start. Sadako is the daughter of Shizuko Yamamura, a psychic woman from rural Japan, whose powers made her both feared and ridiculed. Shizuko became notorious after she demonstrated her abilities in a public experiment, where she correctly identified objects hidden in envelopes. Instead of respect, she received mockery and harassment from the media. Shizuko eventually took her own life, unable to bear the shame and cruelty. Her daughter Sadako inherited her psychic powers, but also inherited the isolation, secrecy, and resentment that came with them. In Suzuki's telling, Sadako's abilities were terrifying, not because they were mystical in the folkloric sense, but because they hinted at a kind of science humans couldn't control. She had psychic potential so powerful that researchers grew obsessed with testing her. In some versions of the story, Sadako becomes the subject of horrific medical experimentation. Malevolent doctors and institutions treat her not as a person, but as a specimen. This part of her backstory drips with injustice. It takes the old folkloric theme, the woman betrayed and wronged, and updates it for the modern era, where science itself becomes the violator. Instead of a cruel samurai master or a jealous lover, Sadako faces a cold, clinical cruelty where men in lab coats push her into rooms and reduce her to data points. Her death seals the archetype. In the novel, she is assaulted and murdered, her body thrown into a well. There she remains, buried in darkness, her fury festering. This is where folklore and literature fuse seamlessly. The well is not just a convenient hiding place. In Japanese ghost lore, wells are liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds, dark cavities that echo with both water and memory. Think of Okiku, the servant girl whose spirit haunted a well, as she counted broken plates. Suzuki knew this. By putting Sadako at the bottom of a well, he was plugging her directly into the deepest current of Japanese ghost tradition. But Suzuki added a modern twist. Sadako doesn't just crawl out of her well to personally attack those who wronged her. She uses her psychic power to implant her rage into technology. Her curse reproduces itself through videotape. Watch it, and you become infected. 7 days later, you die unless you pass it along. This is no longer the wandering ghost in a white kimono knocking on doors. This is rage weaponized as a virus. This is folklore adapted to the VHS generation. What makes literary Sadako fascinating is the way she both mirrors and mutates the onryo archetype. Like the classic vengeful spirit, she is a woman wronged, a woman silenced, a woman discarded. Her long hair and well death tie her directly to the icons of Edo ghost tales. But unlike those earlier spirits, she is not content to haunt a single household or a single betrayer. Her curse is systemic. It spreads through media, through copies, through anyone unlucky enough to stumble across her image. In this way, she embodies not just individual vengeance, but the terrifying idea of contagion, that trauma itself can spread like disease. This was a new kind of horror in the early 90s. Japan was in a period of transition, balancing old traditions with rapid technological change. The economy had boomed and then faltered. Technology was accelerating, bringing VHS and home video into every household. People worried about information overload, about media saturation, about the ways screens were invading their private lives. Suzuki Sadako was the perfect monster for that moment. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a metaphor for fear of what technology could carry, what it could infect, what it could bring into your home without warning. At the same time, Sadako was grounded enough in tradition that she felt instantly recognizable. Japanese readers didn't need a folklore lecture to sense what Suzuki was doing. They could see the long hair, the well, the vengeful silence, and know immediately this was an onryo. But she wasn't only an onryo. She was an onryo spliced with science fiction, with psychic horror, with the anxieties of modern life. That's what made her feel fresh. She was both ancient and new, both local and universal. Literary Sadako is also more ambiguous than the film versions that followed. She is monstrous, yes, but also tragic. She is a victim as much as a villain, born with powers she didn't ask for. Exploited by people who saw her only as a tool. Killed and discarded as if her existence was disposable. When she reaches out from the well, she's reaching not just with anger, but with the despair of someone who was never allowed to simply live. That complexity makes her frightening in a deeper way. She is not evil for the sake of evil. She is the embodiment of suffering that was ignored until it grew poisonous. This is where Suzuki's brilliance lies. He understood that the most enduring monsters aren't the ones that come from nowhere. They are the ones that grow out of real human fears. Sadako's DNA is part Okiku, part onryo, part Heian era ghost story. But it is also part psychic research, part VHS tape, part modern anxiety about how easily information can spread beyond control. She is folklore fused with technology, vengeance fused with infection. When readers first encountered her in 1991, they weren't just reading a scary story. They were looking at a ghost that felt both impossibly old and terrifyingly new. A ghost who had crawled out of well, yes, but also out of history, out of laboratories, out of the wires and screens of a changing world. That's why Sadako worked. She wasn't a rejection of folklore. She was folklore evolved. When people today think of Sadako, they almost never think of Koji Suzuki's novel. They think of the movie, specifically Hideo Nakata's 1998 Ring, the film that took Sadako from a literary concept and turned her into one of the most recognizable monsters in global horror. This was the version that terrified audiences not only in Japan but across Asia and eventually the whole world. It was here that the cursed videotape stopped being just a plot device in a novel and became the central engine of a nightmare. Nakata's adaptation stripped Suzuki's sprawling and sometimes complicated narrative down to its rawest and most haunting parts. Gone were some of the heavier science fiction elements, the genetic experiments, and the more clinical aspects of Sadako's origin. Instead, Nakata leaned hard into atmosphere, suggestion, and imagery. What he gave us was simple but unforgettable. A videotape that kills you 7 days after you watch it. A ghost girl with long black hair covering her face. A final sequence where she crawls out of the television, breaking the boundary between fiction and reality. It's worth pausing here, because these choices are exactly why Sadako leapt from Japanese folklore into international legend. The cursed videotape in the novel had been disturbing, but Nakata turned it into pure cinematic terror. The tape itself is a surreal collection of disjointed images. A woman combing her hair in a mirror, writhing figures, an eye staring through darkness, a well. It looks like an experimental art film spliced together by something inhuman. The tape is short, grainy, and silent, except for the faint hiss of static. Watching, it doesn't feel like watching a movie inside a movie. It feels like stumbling across contraband you were never meant to see. The kind of video that whispers of conspiracy and danger simply by existing. And then comes the rule that burned itself into pop culture. 7 days. Watch the tape and you receive a phone call. A whisper on the other end says only 7 days. That's it. Your countdown has started. There is no explanation, no negotiation, no way out. This timeline is ruthless in its simplicity. It echoes the ticking clock of folklore curses. The idea that once a spirit has marked you, time itself begins to corrode. In Akiku's tale, the plates are counted every night. In Sadako's, the phone call is your plate counting moment. You know she's coming. You just don't know when or how. Of course, the most famous moment comes at the end. The moment when Sadako finally appears. Long hair, wet and tangled, her face completely hidden, she drags herself out of the well in jerky, unnatural motions. Nakata's use of movement here is genius. The actress Rino was filmed walking backward, and the footage was then reversed to create a broken, stuttering effect. The result is deeply uncanny. Her body looks human, but doesn't move like one. She crawls forward on all fours, but her joints bend just slightly wrong, as though her muscles have forgotten how to work. This detail matters because it taps into one of the most primal fears humans have. The sight of something familiar moving in an unfamiliar way. And then she comes out of the screen. Literally. Sadako doesn't just haunt your dreams, she breaks into your living room. One moment, she's on the television. The next, she is crawling through the glass, dripping water onto the floor, dragging her body into the real world. In 1998, this was unlike anything horror audiences had seen before. It was not just a jump scare, it was a violation of the unspoken contract between viewer and movie. We were supposed to be safe on this side of the screen. Sadako shattered that boundary. All of this worked so well because of the medium Nakata chose for her curse. VHS. In the late 90s, VHS tapes were everywhere. They were physical objects, not digital files. They could be copied, shared, left in a corner, passed around without labels. Everyone had a shelf of them. Everyone had tapes with mysterious handwriting on the side, things recorded from late-night television or borrowed from friends. The idea that one of those tapes could be cursed didn't feel far-fetched. It felt uncomfortably possible. Unlike a DVD or a streaming file, VHS was unstable. Tapes degraded, images warped. Static bled into the picture. A tape could suddenly start playing snow or tracking lines for no reason. All of those flaws, which were part of the charm of VHS, became fuel for fear. When Sadako's curse plays out on a VHS, it feels organic. Of course, an evil spirit would choose a format that is unpredictable, glitchy, and difficult to trace. Of course, her curse would travel on something you could never quite control. There's another element here too. VHS was communal. You didn't just watch tapes alone. You passed them to friends, you borrowed them, you recorded things and handed them off. A cursed tape in 1998 was not just an individual threat. It was a social infection. It was the perfect metaphor for urban legends themselves, which spread by being told and retold. Sadako's curse was an urban legend embedded inside a physical object. Once you watched, you couldn't resist passing it on. That's what made it so terrifying. It wasn't just haunting you. It was making you part of the chain. And while all of this is grounded in technology, it circles back to folklore. Think again about Okiku counting her plates, or the endless repetition of onryo in kabuki theater. The curse is always repetitive. It follows ritual. Sadako's videotape is the same. The tape must be watched, the phone call must come, the 7 days must pass, the ritual repeats. It is folklore disguised as modern media. Nakata's genius was in how little he explained. Unlike Western horror films of the time, which often relied on exposition and backstory, Ring gave only fragments. The videotape is never fully explained. Sadako's power is never mapped out scientifically. The rules are simple, and their simplicity makes them terrifying. The less you know, the more the curse feels like it could happen to you. When Japanese audiences saw Ring in 1998, they recognized the onryo archetype instantly. The hair, the kimono, the well. But they also saw something new. A ghost who had adapted perfectly to the late 20th century, slipping into the media that filled their homes. And when Western audiences eventually saw the American remake, they didn't need the folklore background to be afraid. The image of a girl crawling out of a TV is universally horrifying. It speaks to something primal, that our safe spaces are not safe, that the things we consume can consume us. Sadako's transformation in Nakata's film was the moment she stopped being just a character in a novel and became an archetype in her own right. The cursed videotape was more than a plot device. It was a cultural event, a piece of horror history that still gets referenced, parodied, and feared today. And the reason it worked is because it felt real. In a world of unlabeled tapes and static-filled screens, who could say it wasn't? The VHS curse is what made Sadako immortal. She doesn't just haunt a well. She doesn't just haunt a handful of characters. She haunts the very act of watching itself. In 1998, that was revolutionary. And even now, decades later, if someone hands you an unmarked VHS tape and dares you to watch it, you know exactly what face is going to be hiding on the other side. By the time Hideo Nakata's Ring had finished its theatrical run in Japan, the country's horror cinema had changed forever. Audiences left theaters shaken, not by gore or jump scares, but by the suffocating dread of a story that unfolded like a curse. The film was a sensation. It wasn't just a hit, it was the spark that lit what critics soon called the J-horror boom. Suddenly, Japanese horror wasn't a niche curiosity. It was the cutting edge of global fear. Through the late 90s and early 2000s, studios raced to capture the same magic. Directors like Takashi Shimizu brought us Ju-on, The Grudge. Kiyoshi Kurosawa released Pulse. Each of these films carried the DNA of Ring. Pale ghosts with long black hair, minimalist soundscapes, and the overwhelming sense that technology itself was haunted. But Ring was the one that broke the seal. It proved to both Japanese and international audiences that horror could be quiet, restrained, and still utterly devastating. And of course, Hollywood noticed. In 2002, Universal released The Ring, Gore Verbinski's American remake starring Naomi Watts. This was more than just a translation. It was a full-scale cultural reboot. The cursed videotape was still there, the 7-day deadline remained, but the ghost at the center had been reimagined for a new audience. Sadako Yamamura became Samara Morgan, a pale child in rural Washington state whose rage spread across the American suburban landscape. The differences between the two versions are fascinating because they reveal how each culture frames its horror. In Nakata's Ring, Sadako is a shadowy, almost abstract figure. She doesn't speak. She doesn't explain herself. Her motives and methods remain mostly unknowable. She is an onryo in the truest sense, pure vengeance, stripped of humanity, a force of nature. The fear comes from not understanding her, from the impossibility of stopping her. In Verbinski's remake, Samara is given more backstory, more psychological grounding. We see her adoptive parents, the isolation of the family farm, the eerie videotaped psychiatric sessions. The American film leans heavily into the idea of trauma and abuse within a family unit. Samara isn't just a ghost, she is a disturbed child whose parents failed to contain her psychic torment. Where Sadako feels like a myth, Samara feels like a case study. Western horror, especially at the time, often needed explanation, motivation, psychology. American audiences wanted to know why. That doesn't mean Samara was any less terrifying. In fact, for many US viewers, she was even more so, because she spoke directly to anxieties familiar in American life. The creepy child archetype has always been powerful in Western horror. Think of The Exorcist, The Omen, or Children of the Corn. Samara fit neatly into that tradition, a child who should represent innocence, but instead radiates corruption. Her pale face and wide, expressionless eyes made her instantly iconic. And then there's the television crawl. That scene crossed borders without losing an ounce of power. Whether you were in Tokyo, London, or Los Angeles, watching a girl crawl out of a television screen was nightmare fuel. It didn't matter if you had ever seen a no play or heard the tale of Okiku. The image was primal. It violated the one barrier every audience trusts, the frame of the screen. Horror movies are supposed to happen to other people. Sadako and Samara made them happen to you. Western audiences latched onto this instantly. The remake's marketing leaned hard into the cursed tape gimmick. Blank VHS cassettes with the tape's imagery were left in public places. Trailers played in theaters with no explanation, just the haunting montage of images. The campaign mirrored the way urban legends spread. Quiet whispers, shared warnings, a sense that you might already be infected just by watching. And it worked. The Ring was a box office juggernaut, pulling in over $200 million worldwide and becoming one of the most successful horror remakes of all time. The impact didn't stop there. After The Ring, Hollywood went on a remake spree. The Grudge got an American adaptation in 2004. Dark Water, Pulse, and One Missed Call all received remakes. For a few years, J-horror was not just a Japanese phenomenon, but a global brand, and at the center of it all was the image of a girl in white, with hair covering her face, crawling out of a screen. It's important to understand why that image translated so universally. In Japan, it carried centuries of cultural resonance. The long hair, the burial kimono, the well, all of it rooted in yurei folklore. In the US, those details didn't matter. What mattered was the intrusion. The screen had always been a safe boundary, a glowing square that delivered stories but never let them out. To see Samara break that boundary was to see the nightmare of media itself, that the things you watch might not stay where they belong. In a culture already anxious about television's influence, the image hit like a thunderclap. So while Sadako and Samara are cousins, born from the same haunted videotape, they are shaped by different fears. Sadako is vengeance distilled, an onryo reimagined for the modern age. Samara is trauma incarnate, the embodiment of familial horror and repressed abuse. Both crawl out of the screen, but the meaning shifts with the culture. What unites them is the viral nature of their curse. Whether through whispered ghost stories in Edo, Japan, copied VHS tapes in the 90s, or Hollywood trailers in 2002, the story spreads by repetition. You see it, you pass it on. That's how folklore survives. That's how urban legends work. And that's how Sadako, born from Japanese theater and literature, became Samara, the face of American nightmares. The global explosion of Ring wasn't just about a single ghost girl. It was about the fusion of old folklore with new media, about how fear adapts to whatever culture it enters. In Japan, Sadako crawled out of the well. In America, Samara crawled out of the TV. And everywhere, audiences realized the same terrible truth. If she can crawl out once, she can crawl out anywhere. Sadako may have been born in literature and cemented in the Carter's 1998 film, but her story didn't stop there. Once you create a ghost powerful enough to terrify an entire nation, you can't keep her locked in a single well. She has crawled through countless sequels, spin-offs, reboots, and even crossover battles, each one mutating her origin a little more, stretching the boundaries of what she represents. And just like the curse tape itself, Sadako has been copied so many times that every new version feels a little more distorted. The first attempt to continue her story came quickly. In 1998, alongside Nakata's Ring, another film was released called Rasen, or Spiral. It was based on Koji Suzuki's direct sequel novel and took a more science fiction route. Instead of leaning fully into folklore, Rasen treated Sadako's curse as something closer to a virus, almost biological in nature. Victims weren't just killed, they were infected, their cells rewritten by Sadako's psychic DNA. It was an ambitious attempt to keep the mythology grounded in science, but audiences weren't interested. Rasen flopped, and today it's often forgotten, overshadowed by the success of Nakata's film. The producers learned quickly. When Ring 2 arrived in 1999, it abandoned most of Rasen's biomedical weirdness and returned Sadako to the shadows of ghostly vengeance. The focus shifted back to atmosphere and dread, with Sadako's curse spreading like a rumor through society. This back-and-forth tug between science and folklore has defined Sadako ever since. Sometimes she is the psychic child of tragic experiments, sometimes she is the timeless onryo crawling out of a well, and sometimes she is both at once. By the 2000s, the franchise had grown restless. New entries like Sadako 3D in 2012 and its sequel in 2013 tried to update her for the digital era. No longer bound to VHS tapes, Sadako's curse spread through online videos, emails, and viral content. The imagery became more exaggerated, the kills flashier, the ghost herself rendered in CGI that could leap at the camera. These films were less subtle, less restrained than Nakata's original, where 1998's Ring thrived on quiet dread. Sadako 3D leaned into spectacle, almost turning her into a jump-scare mascot. Some fans loved the modernization, others mourned the loss of mystery. Still, the shift makes sense. A ghost tied forever to VHS would risk fading into nostalgia. By infecting the internet, Sadako proved she could adapt. She wasn't just a product of the 90s. She was a flexible archetype, able to crawl into whatever technology people feared most. VHS in the 90s, streaming video in the 2010s. It raises the uncomfortable thought. If the curse were rewritten today, would she be a TikTok filter? A glitching face in a Zoom call? Sadako's power lies in her ability to evolve with the medium. But the strangest, and maybe most entertaining, twist in her journey came in 2016 with Sadako versus Kayako. This was Japan's answer to Freddy versus Jason. Instead of two slashers meeting for a bloody showdown, it was two ghosts, both bound by their own cursed spaces, colliding in one supernatural battle. On one side, Sadako, the girl from the well whose curse spreads through screens. On the other, Kayako, the spirit of Ju-on, the grudge, who haunts the house where she and her son were murdered. The film leaned into the absurdity of the matchup, with unlucky teenagers caught between the two curses and deciding the only way to survive was to pit the ghosts against each other. The result is as campy as it sounds. Sadako's VHS curse collides with Kayako's haunted house, creating sequences where one curse infects the other, where ghosts literally fight over victims. The climax, without spoiling too much, fuses their legends together in a way that's both ridiculous and strangely inevitable. Critics were divided. Was it fun fan service or a dilution of both characters? But audiences showed up because the idea of watching two of Japan's greatest horror icons collide was irresistible. And that's the point. By 2016, Sadako wasn't just a character, she was an icon. Like Freddy Krueger with his glove or Jason Voorhees with his hockey mask, Sadako had her own instantly recognizable trademarks: the long hair covering her face, the white dress, the crawl out of the screen. She had graduated from folklore figure to brand mascot. She could be placed in sequels, reboots, even a ghostly cage match, and audiences would know her instantly. What does this say about the creation of ghost icons? It tells us that even the most traditional figures can be reshaped into global symbols if they strike the right chord. Sadako began as a literary remix of Japanese folklore. She became a cinematic nightmare. And eventually, she turned into a pop culture archetype capable of crossovers and parodies without losing her core identity. That doesn't mean every sequel has been good, far from it. But the fact that she keeps returning, morphing, adapting, means she has joined the ranks of horror's immortals. Sadako's evolution shows us something important about how horror works. Monsters don't stay static. Dracula went from gothic novel to Hollywood cape to teenage heartthrob. Zombies shifted from voodoo corpses to viral infection metaphors. And Sadako went from a Heian-era archetype to a VHS specter to an internet ghost meme. Each era gets the monster it deserves, the monster that embodies its fears. Sadako is proof that ghosts are not frozen in tradition. They crawl forward, dragging their curses with them, adapting to whatever screen we fear most. So whether she's lurking in a grainy videotape, popping out of a smartphone, or tag-teaming with Kayako in a supernatural wrestling match, Sadako endures. Not because of any single film or backstory, but because she embodies something bigger, the unstoppable spread of fear, the idea that once a story takes hold, it can never be buried again. Like her victims. We are all part of the chain. When you strip away the jump scares and the VHS static, Sadako is not just a monster. She is a symbol, and that's why she endures. Every part of her design, from the well she was thrown into, to the hair covering her face, to the way her curse spreads, is loaded with meaning. To understand why she resonates so deeply, we need to look at what she represents in her own culture, and how that meaning shifts once she crosses borders. In Japan, Sadako is tragedy first and terror second. She embodies the weight of repressed trauma. Her origin story is one of abuse, neglect, and silencing. Born with psychic powers she didn't choose, exploited by men who treated her as an experiment, murdered and discarded, she is the ultimate figure of someone society refused to acknowledge. Her curse is not random. It is rage forced underground until it explodes. The well she is thrown into becomes the perfect metaphor. It is deep, dark, and invisible from the surface. To walk by, you might not even notice it. But inside is a body, a memory, a wound left to rot. The well is not just her grave. It is the collective silence of a society that prefers to hide its shame rather than confront it. This is why she terrifies Japanese audiences on more than just a supernatural level. She is the ghost of what is forgotten, what is buried, what is swept under the rug. The long hair over her face represents the erasure of identity. She is faceless because her individuality was never allowed to exist. She comes back not to whisper or to seek reconciliation, but to demand that her suffering be remembered. Every victim of her curse becomes a witness, unwilling or not. In that sense, Sadako is not just a ghost of vengeance. She is a ghost of memory, forcing the living to confront what they would rather ignore. In Western adaptations, especially Gore Verbinski's The Ring, her meaning shifted. Samara Morgan is framed less as a social tragedy and more as a personal one. She becomes a representation of family violence, parental neglect, and the dangers of secrets kept inside the home. While Sadako is tied to cultural silence and systemic cruelty, Samara is tied to domestic abuse and the horror of the broken family unit. Both versions center on a child or young woman who was mistreated and silenced, but the framing changes. In Japan, the curse is society's fault. In America, the curse is the family's fault. Another difference lies in how the technology is interpreted. In Japan, the cursed videotape is frightening because it feels like folklore adapted to the present day, an urban legend woven into modern media. It is tradition updating itself. Abroad, especially in the US, audiences saw the cursed tape as a techno-curse, a metaphor for fear of technology itself. The early 2000s were filled with anxiety about how screens and media might corrupt us. Samara's tape was interpreted as commentary on media saturation, the danger of viral content, and the idea that watching the wrong thing could infect you. It was less about memory and more about paranoia. But at the core, in both cultures, Sadako and Samara carry the same underlying theme, the fear of being forgotten. What gives them power is not just that they kill, but that they demand to be seen. They force their victims to carry their image, to remember their story. Sadako's curse spreads because forgetting is the true horror. The moment her story stops being told, she disappears again into the well, erased. By infecting new people, she ensures her trauma will never vanish. In this sense, her curse is her survival mechanism. She is memory weaponized. Think about how the curse functions. You watch the tape, you see her story, and then you die unless you pass it on. The only way to survive is to duplicate the memory, to keep spreading it. Sadako's existence depends on refusing oblivion. That is why she still terrifies. On some level, we all fear being buried and forgotten. We all fear that our pain, our struggles, our identity could be erased and no one would care. Sadako is the nightmare version of that fear, a ghost who punishes the living simply for trying to look away. Her story also reveals the paradox of horror icons. She is faceless, voiceless, erased, yet she has become one of the most recognizable horror figures in the world. She is neglected in death, but unforgettable in culture. That contradiction is what makes her so powerful. Sadako reminds us that you cannot silence trauma forever. Whether it comes back as a whispered legend, a cursed videotape, or an image crawling out of a television screen, it will return, and it will demand attention. In the end, Sadako is not only about fear of ghosts, she is about fear of history, fear of memory, fear of silence. She is the ghost of the buried wound, the ignored victim, the forgotten tragedy. In Japan, she reflects cultural anxieties about shame, repression, and the social tendency to hide what is uncomfortable. Abroad, she becomes the embodiment of technological anxiety and media paranoia. But in both versions, she remains what she has always been. The horror of being forgotten, the ghost who demands to be remembered. That's why she has lasted across decades, cultures, and countless adaptations. Because no matter who you are, no matter where you live, the fear is the same. We all dread the idea that we could be erased, that our story could vanish. Sadako refuses to let that happen. She crawls out of the well, out of the screen, and into our memory, making sure we never forget her again. By the time the 2000s rolled into the age of broadband internet and smartphones, one question hung over Sadako like damp hair over her face. What happens to a VHS ghost when VHS itself goes extinct? The answer turned out to be both ironic and strangely fitting. Instead of vanishing with the format that made her famous, Sadako slipped almost seamlessly into the digital age. She became a meme, a creepypasta, a viral challenge. In other words, she became exactly what she always was, a curse designed to spread. The original brilliance of Sadako's curse was how perfectly it mirrored the way stories travel. You watch the tape, you tell someone else, the infection multiplies. That's folklore in a nutshell. Urban legends survive by being passed along, whispered at school, retold around campfires. In the 90s, VHS was the perfect vehicle for that logic. But in the 2010s, the vehicle changed. Suddenly, it wasn't dusty cassettes being handed off. It was YouTube links, TikTok filters, Twitter memes. Sadako was practically built for this transition. Online, she's everywhere. Clips of her crawling out of the TV became GIFs, endlessly looped. Her image is recycled into reaction memes, often with captions like, "Me leaving my bed at 3 a.m. for snacks," or "Your ex when you block them." TikTok uses stage skits where Sadako pops out of a television only to be met with eye rolls, dance moves, or even thirst traps. YouTube creators film fake cursed challenges where they watch the tape and pretend to wait 7 days for the ghost to arrive. Far from killing her mystique, the internet gave Sadako a second life as a digital folk character, half terrifying, half parody, instantly recognizable. This transformation says a lot about how horror survives in the internet era. Ghosts don't have to stay terrifying to stay alive, they just have to stay circulating. Sadako's VHS curse was about forced repetition. The online Sadako works the same way, only now the repetition comes in the form of shares, likes, and reposts. Every time her image is memed, she spreads a little further, ensuring she'll never vanish down her well completely. But this raises a bigger question. Is Sadako still scary when she's also a meme? For many younger viewers, their first exposure to her isn't Nakata's suffocating dread or Verbinski's Hollywood remake. It's a looping GIF on Twitter. It's a parody TikTok. It's Sadako dancing for promotional events in Japan, where studios even dress actresses in her costume to hand out flyers or throw the first pitch at baseball games. She has gone from horror to pop culture mascot. And yet, the fear isn't completely gone. If anything, it lurks underneath the humor. Because at the end of the day, Sadako is still the figure with hair across her face, still the drowned body climbing out of the screen. Even as a joke, she carries the residue of unease. Everyone knows what she represents, and that's what keeps her effective. The laughter is a way to cope with the fact that she is fundamentally a ghost born of trauma. The meme doesn't erase the dread, it coexists with it. There's also an irony here. Sadako was designed for VHS, a technology that was physical, glitchy, unstable. Today's screens are clean, high definition, always in our pockets. And yet the thought of her slipping through them is, if anything, more unnerving. We used to sit safely on our couches and tell ourselves she couldn't crawl out of the screen. But now the screens are everywhere, in our hands, beside our beds, in our classrooms and offices. If her curse were updated, she wouldn't need to wait for you to insert a tape. She would just need you to scroll. That's the paradox of Sadako in the digital age. She may be joked about, parodied, memed into oblivion, but she also feels more plausible than ever. Viral content really can ruin your life. A single video really can spread across the world overnight. One wrong click really can infect your device. Sadako anticipated all of that before it became reality. She is a ghost who was always, at heart, about virality. VHS was just the first skin she wore. The internet is simply her next. So, is she still scary when we all carry a screen in our pocket? Maybe scarier, because now there is no boundary between the haunted object and our lives. You don't have to borrow a tape from a friend. You don't even have to leave your room. All you need is a notification, a click, a share. In a world where everything we consume is potentially viral, Sadako feels less like an outdated relic and more like a prophecy we're still living through. The joke memes, the TikTok parodies, the baseball stadium appearances, they all prove the same thing. Sadako is still here. She crawled out of the well, out of the VHS, and into the endless scroll of our feeds. And as long as we keep watching, keep sharing, keep remembering her, she will never sink back into silence. She was never just a ghost on tape. She was always a ghost in the machine. Sadako began as a classic onryo, the kind of vengeful spirit that had been haunting Japanese imagination for centuries. Long hair, white burial clothes, a tragic death, and a rage too heavy to stay buried. She could have remained just another figure in folklore's endless gallery of betrayed women, but instead, she crawled forward, adapting with each new era, each new screen. From Heian-era poems to Edo ghost scrolls, from Suzuki's novel to Nakata's film, from VHS shelves to TikTok feeds, Sadako has never stayed in one place. She refuses to be forgotten, because forgetting is her true death. And that's what makes her so unique. She's not just a horror villain, she's a cultural archetype. To Japanese audiences, she is the tragedy of silenced trauma and hidden wounds, a ghost forcing society to look at what it wants to bury. To Western audiences, she is the paranoia of technology turned against us, a cursed screen that breaks into our lives. Both readings are valid, and both explain why she remains terrifying. Because Sadako is the reminder that horror evolves right alongside us. Ghosts don't disappear, they just change formats. When she crawls out of the well, she isn't just climbing into a living room, she's climbing into a tradition, into memory, into the space where folklore updates itself to match the fears of the moment. Every time she reappears on VHS, on DVD, in streaming adaptations, in memes, she proves the same point. You can't mute her, you can't skip her, you can't fast forward past her curse. Sadako is always waiting just one play button away. And honestly, good luck trying to mute her on Netflix. She's probably buffering in the background right now, just waiting for your Wi-Fi to glitch so she can crawl through. So the question now is, where does she go next? What new screens will she invade? What new fears will she take on? Sadako is timeless, not because she stays the same, but because she refuses to. And that makes her more than a ghost story. It makes her folklore in motion. Which brings me to you. If Sadako is just one mask of Japan's long tradition of haunted women, which other spirits should we unmask next? Should we look at Kayako from The Grudge, the ghost who makes her home in an entire house? Or maybe Okiku, the servant girl whose broken plates still echo from the bottom of her well? Or perhaps we should step outside Japan and unearth the hidden demons of other cultures? Let me know in the comments. The most requested spirit might just crawl onto this channel in the next deep dive. Until then, remember, stories don't stay buried, and neither do ghosts. Especially not ones that already know how to find your screen. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you liked it and want to listen to more, feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.